Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Seizure Smart Training Basics presentation. My name is Martin Hernandez, and I am here on behalf of the Epilepsy Foundation of Minnesota. From today's presentation, we hope that you're able to learn basic epilepsy facts and figures, that you will be able to identify the 4 leading types of seizures, and most important of all, learning the appropriate responses should you encounter someone who is having a seizure. So to start off, what is epilepsy? Epilepsy is a neurological condition characterized by unprovoked and recurrent seizures. So the 3 key words there in the description of epilepsy, first off, neurological. So that means it's a condition occurring within someone's brain or their neurological system. Unprovoked, so not occurring because of another medical condition, things such as diabetes, so having high insulin levels or low blood sugar. Someone could have a diabetic seizure. We know in children we see seizures due to high fever, febrile seizures, and we'll talk a little bit more about those later on. And then recurrent, so someone who is having more than one. With some of those other seizure types, it's possible for someone to have a one-time seizure. However, someone with epilepsy would be having multiple unprovoked seizures. And finally, you may hear epilepsy referred to as a seizure disorder or a seizure condition. However, we at EFMN recommend using the term epilepsy just because that is the most correct term for the condition. A couple key epilepsy facts to clear up some myths. Epilepsy is not contagious, so it is not caused by a virus or a bacteria. It is a physical disorder occurring within the patient's brain. Epilepsy is not classified as a mental illness, such as anxiety or depression. It is a neurological disorder. We know that people can have both epilepsy and a mental illness. However, they are not the same thing. This one I always like to focus in on. Epilepsy exists on a spectrum. So you can have 2 people who have a diagnosis of epilepsy. The first person has been on a single medication for decades. They have gone years without having a seizure. It has been controlled by a single medication, and thus they have been able to drive, hold any type of job that they would like, really not having faced too many challenges with their diagnosis of epilepsy because it has been under control. And then you can have someone else who also has a diagnosis of epilepsy. However, they have been on multiple medications. They might be having seizures on a daily or weekly basis, and thus they aren't able to drive. And there's certain types of jobs that they won't be able to hold because of the fact that they are having seizures on such a regular and uncontrolled basis. Both of these people would have epilepsy. However, because of the spectrum in which epilepsy can manifest itself, to completely different lived experiences. And then finally, people will rarely die from having a seizure. There are a couple cases in which death might occur from having a seizure. However, it is extremely rare that this will happen. The current prevalence of epilepsy, about 1 in 26 people will develop epilepsy at some point in their lifetime. About 1 in 10 people will have a seizure. These, again, could be either someone with epilepsy having a seizure or one of those isolated seizures, such as a febrile seizure or a diabetic seizure. Approximately 54,000 people in Minnesota have epilepsy. And then we see about 200,000 new cases of epilepsy and seizure disorders being diagnosed each year in the United States. Some additional statistics. Epilepsy is the 4th most common neurological condition after migraines, stroke, Alzheimer's disease. It is the leading brain condition in children. About 1/3 of the people with epilepsy live with uncontrolled seizures. And adults with epilepsy are more likely to have 4 or more co-occurring chronic conditions. And these can be things such as mood disorders like anxiety, depression, ADHD. They may suffer from migraines, They may have sleep disturbances or sleep disorders, and autism. Those are the common ones that we see occurring within the epilepsy community. Some additional demographics for the epilepsy community in the United States. We see that people with low economic status are 2 to 4 times more likely to have seizures. African Americans and Hispanics are nearly 40% of the people who are diagnosed with epilepsy. About 1/3 of the children living with epilepsy live in food insecure homes. And about 50% of adults with active epilepsy have an annual family income of about less than $25,000. Looking at some of the leading causes of epilepsy, again, epilepsy being a neurological condition, these are mainly to do with the patient's brain. So a brain infection such as meningitis, a brain injury at birth, changes in someone's brain development, a brain lesion or a brain tumor, and an injury to the head. So we have seen people who may strike their head on an object, and then even after they recover from the initial injury, they will develop epilepsy from that injury to their head. People after having suffered a stroke may at times develop epilepsy in the future. But the majority of cases, that 60 to 70% of people, the cause is unknown. As far as why it is unknown, we may not have the technology at the moment to accurately pinpoint exactly what the cause, where in their brain it's occurring. The damage may be too small, or too much time may have passed between the specific event and the seizures that they are currently having to properly link the cause to the effect. When we look at what is a seizure, seizures are sudden and involve brief uncontrolled electrical activity in the brain. Seizures can occur with other conditions as well. As I mentioned, there are things known as isolated seizures, and that is something that about 1 in every 10 people will have at some point in their life. And examples of those were diabetic seizures resulting from excessive insulin or low blood sugar, febrile seizures in children caused by high fevers. And also we know that withdrawal seizures can occur if someone is undergoing withdrawal from drugs or alcohol. Seizures will display in different ways depending on the area of the brain that is involved. So if it's the entire brain, if it's one location, and then precisely where in the brain it is happening. So as you can see in the picture, it's occurring in the brain. And what happens is that you see a sudden excessive discharge of electrical impulses between the brain's neurons, and that is what will lead to the person having a seizure. Every person has something known as a seizure threshold, and for some people it is higher, for some people it is lower. And if anyone ever exceeds their seizure threshold, then they will have a seizure. And so here we have a list of potential seizure triggers that can affect that seizure threshold. And for someone with epilepsy, a trigger would be something that occurs fairly consistently before a seizure, more often than by chance. Being able to know what your triggers may be so you can be aware of that and track them throughout the day is helpful in managing your epilepsy. The most common seizure trigger we see is missed or late medication. So someone forgetting to take their pills at the prescribed time, that has been keeping their epilepsy seizures under control. Stress and anxiety, lack of sleep, fatigue, and hormonal changes will all affect that seizure threshold. So if someone is already has a pretty low seizure threshold, affecting it in such a way would cause them to have a seizure. We know alcohol and recreational drugs interacting with their medication potentially can also cause someone to have a seizure. Overheating and dehydration, having a poor diet, or missing meals. These are all things that will, again, potentially affect someone's seizure threshold. And if they are already close to having a seizure, could potentially push them over the edge into where they will have a seizure. So for folks living with epilepsy, these are all things that they will want to keep a lookout for in their day-to-day lives in order to make sure that they're able to stay safe and under control. And finally, one of the most common ones that we hear about and see is photosensitivity. So that is a trigger that is caused by any sudden change in light. So either watching the TV in a dark room, some video games, strobe lights. It only affects about 3% of those living with epilepsy, but still another thing to look out for if that is a potential trigger that someone has. So when it comes to classifying the different types of seizures that there are, we're going to look at a couple of them coming up, but there are three main questions that are asked. The first is, where in the brain is the seizure located? So is it a focal seizure, a seizure that is occurring in one location, one part of the brain? Is it a generalized seizure that is occurring throughout the entirety of the brain? It's possible that it would be unknown. Again, if the doctor is not able to necessarily pinpoint where the seizure is happening. Secondly, is the person's awareness altered? For some types of seizures, the person will remain aware throughout the seizure. And there are other types during which the person will not be aware and would not know what's going on while they're having their seizure. And then finally, have any additional changes occurred to the person's movements, their sensations? Are their behaviors altered, or is their pattern of speech altered during the seizure? Many times the person having the seizure will not be aware and be able to track all of the different parts that occurred during the seizure. And so either their family member, someone at school, someone who is around them when they're having their seizure, them documenting the answers to these three questions is important, and then them working with their doctor to help identify the type of seizure that they have been having. And the first type of seizure we're going to look at is known as a focal aware seizure. These were formerly known as simple partial seizures. So someone having this seizure, this type of seizure, would have no change in their awareness. However, the changes would be involved in their sensation. So they may taste, hear, or smell things that aren't there. Their movement, we may see their arms extend or rhythmically tapping their legs or their fingers. They may feel emotions and thoughts brought on by the seizure. So feelings of unexplained fear or joy or confusion. These typically only last a few seconds to up to 2 minutes. Emotional reassurance to the person is key to help get them through this type of seizure because they will be aware during the seizure, and then documenting the time from when it began to when it ended, what we can witness in the person, if they made any movements. Documenting all that information, again, will be important for their doctors. And many times we see focal aware seizures as potential auras or a warning sign of a more intense seizure coming on. The second type of seizure is known as the focal impaired awareness seizure. These were formerly known as complex partial seizures. And so during this type of seizure, the person is not aware, their consciousness is altered, and we may see them display repetitive, purposeless movements again. So they may start to bounce their leg, they may scratch the side of their arm. They will typically display a blank stare, so they may look off to the distance, look off to the side. It may seem like they're not looking anywhere in particular during the seizure. They may start to change up their speech, so they maybe start to repeat something. They may say something that doesn't make sense for the moment, the situation that they're in during the type of seizure. And then because they are going to be unaware during this type of seizure, they may become agitated. If we try to restrain them, their fight or flight response will be activated. And so if someone is having this type of seizure, we don't want to try and grab them or restrain them because they may strike out, lash, and hurt themselves or the person trying to help them out. These should typically last 1 to 3 minutes in length. And coming up, we're going to see a short video. And as we watch that video, I want you to think as to how this type of seizure may be confused with other behaviors. So there in the video, we saw the man was walking through the mall, and then he began to have his focal impaired awareness seizure. He dropped his bags, he looked off to the side. His walk was altered to where he kind of began to sway back and forth in place. He did that repetitive tugging and grasping of his shirt. He was staring blankly off to one side, even while he was moving. And then when the security guard came up and tried to talk to him, ask him a question as to what was going on, he was unable to respond because he was having his seizure and he was not aware of what was going on around him. And the appropriate response, if we should encounter someone having this type of seizure, will always depend on the person and the situation. But most importantly, stay calm, track the seizure from the beginning to the end. We won't want to restrain the person because they are unaware of what is going on. They may try to strike or lash out at the person who is attempting to help them. However, depending again on the situation and where the seizure is occurring, it may be necessary to gently direct the person away from any hazards. So say someone is on the side of the road when they start to have their seizure, you can gently from behind, by directing them with their shoulders, guide them away from the street towards somewhere where they will be safe, and then remain with the person until they have regained full awareness. Potentially after they come out of their seizure, they may not be aware that they even had a seizure. It may take them several minutes to return to their normal state, and they may have a headache and feel tired afterwards. These next two types of seizures are generalized seizures. So these are seizures that are occurring in the entirety of the brain, and thus awareness will be altered in both of these. The first one is known as an absence seizure, formerly known as petit mal. These are brief and sudden lapses in awareness, and they are characterized by brief staring and or rapid facial movements. They quickly return to typical awareness with this type of seizure, lasting usually between 5 to 20 seconds in length. At times, this type of seizure may be confused in children as someone daydreaming or having attention issues. And again, as with all of the type of seizures that we're looking at, it is important to track the time and document what has happened with the patient while they're having this type of seizure. Coming up, we're going to see a video of someone having an absence seizure.
This girl has absence seizures, and you will see her have one while she's talking.
Because he can be as heavy as ever.
And there's a real blankness, a vacant look in the eye, and then all of a sudden they're right back with you and able to engage.
So there you saw the young girl was having a conversation with the interviewer. She was answering his question, and then she begins to have her absence seizure. And so she stares off for a second. During that time, she would not have been aware of what was going on. However, she quickly regains full consciousness, and then you even see her there at the end ask him to try and reorient herself as to where she was in the conversation. The final type of seizure is known as the generalized tonic-clonic seizure. These were formerly known as grand mal. These are the type of seizure that most people associate with epilepsy. However, it is not the most common type. We will typically see this seizure progress through a series of stages, beginning with a sudden cry or moan, as the air is expelled from the lungs at the beginning of the seizure. The person then loses consciousness, and so if they were standing anywhere, they will fall, and that's where some of the danger can come in for this type of seizure. They may get injured as they fall. And then we see them enter the tonic phase, which is when their body gets extended and rigid. And then they enter the second phase, the clonic phase, which is the rhythmic shaking or jerking. We may also see the person lose bowel control or bladder control. Their breathing may be altered or temporarily suspended. We may see a bluish or grayish skin color occurring during this type of seizure. These will typically last 1 to 3 minutes in length. Coming out of the seizure, the person may feel tired, sore, or confused. They may have a headache. They will likely not remember what happened and may not know that they have had a seizure. Coming up, we're going to see a video that shows this type of seizure as well.
They affect the whole brain and the entire body. The tonic phase is the stiffening of the muscles. Then the jerking movements begin, the clonic activity that you see here. A tonic-clonic seizure rarely lasts more than a few minutes. A person having one isn't conscious and won't remember what happened. The skin may become pale. Breathing may seem shallow or labored. Sometimes a child may lose bladder or bowel control or vomit as the seizure ends. These seizures may look painful or even life-threatening.
And as you saw there, the young girl was drooling out of the side of her mouth. That is something that we see with generalized tonic-clonic seizures. Excess saliva is produced, and if they're turned over to their side, then it can drool out. You saw the involvement of her eyes, so her eyes were blinking rapidly. And then there was also that vocalization you heard from her vocal cords being triggered by her seizure. So if we do encounter someone who is having a generalized tonic-clonic seizure, the proper response is to time the seizure from the beginning until the end. And so that would be from the beginning when they lose consciousness until the end when their body goes, when their muscles and body go limp, coming out of that clonic shaking phase. You'll want to turn the individual over onto their side so that that saliva or excess drool, gravity can allow it to flow out of their mouth. Because they may potentially shake, we don't want their head hitting against the hard ground. So any type of jacket or a pillow that is available, using that to cushion the side of their head. Removing anything that may get in the way of a proper response, so giving the person some space, and then staying with the person until they are fully aware, coming out of their seizure. And again, for some people coming out of this type of seizure, they may still feel tired or confused even after the seizure is over. One thing that we always like to mention at this point is we want to make sure to keep the person's mouth free of anything. Something that people used to believe was putting something in a person having a seizure's mouth was the proper response. However, we want to keep their mouth free of any sort of obstruction. This is for a couple reasons. Mainly, as they're having the seizure, they may bite down on whatever we put in their mouth and thus damage a tooth, damage their jaw, or worse yet, they may break off a piece of whatever we put in their mouth and then begin to choke on what we put in their mouth. And so keeping a person's mouth free so that they're allowed to breathe during their seizure, really important. When to call 911, if a person has a seizure ID bracelet or their history of seizures is known, calling an ambulance may not always be necessary. However, there are some situations in which you should always call 911. The first one is if this is a first-time seizure, if an injury takes place. So again, if a person has a seizure and falls over, if they hit their head on the side of a table, so now there's an additional injury that occurred, that would be a situation in which we'd call an ambulance. If breathing ever completely stops, there again are, although dying from a seizure can be rare. One of the times that it can happen is known as status epilepticus, and this is a seizure that is lasting longer than 5 minutes. So the seizure, again, that's why it's important to time the seizure. So if it's gone on for longer than 5 minutes, you'll want to call an ambulance. If a seizure ever takes place in water, because we don't know if the person has ingested any water during the course of the seizure, again, you'll want to call 911. If we know that a person has other underlying health conditions, such as cardiac, or if they happen to be pregnant, those are two situations in which you'd want to call 911 as well. But then to cover all that by saying, if you ever feel that you can't respond appropriately, you should definitely call 911. So coming up on the end of our presentation, we here at EFMN have a variety of epilepsy resources. We provide people with seizure action plans. These are written out forms that they can have. If it is a student, they can have it with their school. If they are adults and they are in a place of work, they can have it on file at work. These would detail what steps they would like taken should they have a seizure either at school or at work. We always recommend that people with epilepsy have those so that those around them can respond appropriately. We would also mention there what medications they should have administered to them. Because it is so important for doctors to keep track of the types of seizures that a person is having, we also have seizure observation records, and these allow for teachers, parents, coworkers to write down for a person who is having seizures regularly exactly what type they are having and what is occurring during their seizures, timing it, all important information for their medical team to have. There's devices such as the watch on the page that is a seizure alert device, and these can be programmed to detect if someone is having a seizure. It will then send an alert out to a family member or a trusted friend so that they can come and assist the person. And these allow for greater amounts of freedom for someone who is living with epilepsy, so they can still feel confident that should they have a seizure, someone will be alerted. We have seizure tracking apps. These allow, again, similar to the seizure observation record, for people to keep better track of when and how they are having their seizures. And as we talked about earlier, there are some common seizure triggers. So if you're able to closely track your seizures, you may be able to draw a link between what your seizure triggers may be. And again, this allows greater control of your condition and freedom. And finally, there are medicine reminder apps that will tell people when they should be taking their medication, and thus keeping them regular and hopefully seizure-free. At EFMN, we also have a information services department where we offer free one-on-one support, customized tools and resources on a variety of epilepsy-related topics. And if there are any materials that you would like, click on the link, and we would be more than happy to follow up with you and send you any of the materials that we have that you may like to have. Well, thank you all so much. I'm glad that you were able to join us for this presentation. By all means, feel free to reach out to myself or any one of us at EFMN. We would love to hear from you, and we would love to follow up and assist you in any way that you may like. Again, thank you all for joining today, and have a wonderful rest of your day.